Ambassador Sawyer stood at the center of the vast council chamber, his figure dwarfed by the opulence of the alien architecture around him. The walls shimmered with holographic displays of star systems and distant galaxies, their light casting faint shadows over the gathered leaders of the Karnath Dominion, a proud species that spanned dozens of worlds. Their elongated, silver-hued bodies sat poised in regal seats, eyes gleaming with a mix of curiosity and disdain as they gazed at the humans standing before them. Sawyer had seen this before, the arrogance, the dismissiveness. He had been through enough diplomatic meetings to recognize the telltale signs of a civilization on the brink of making a catastrophic decision. Still, his voice remained steady, diplomatic as ever. "I implore you to reconsider," Sawyer said, his voice echoing softly throughout the chamber. "This is not a war you can win." At the head of the table sat Varnak, supreme strategist of the Karnath military. His stern, metallic face gave nothing away, but the faint curl of his thin lips betrayed his thoughts. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, studying Sawyer with a predator's gaze. "Ambassador," Varnak began slowly, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. "We appreciate the humans' concern, but you misunderstand. The Karnath have never lost a war in our 5,000-year history. We have stood against invaders before and triumphed." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber, the other Karnath leaders nodding solemnly. Sawyer had read the reports, studied their history. They were a species born in war, their entire civilization shaped by conquest and survival. But this war, this conflict with the Azarth coalition, a far more advanced and ruthless adversary, was different. The coalition's technology far surpassed anything the Karnath had faced before, and their tactics were devastatingly efficient. Sawyer chose his next words carefully. "You believe in your strength, and rightly so. But the Azarth are not like your previous enemies. They do not play by the same rules, and they have no desire for conquest. They seek only to eliminate threats. Once they perceive you as such, they will not stop until every one of your worlds has been reduced to ash." The chamber fell into a tense silence. Sawyer could feel the weight of their pride pressing down on him. He wasn't here to insult them, but the truth was unavoidable. As a diplomat, his job was to prevent war, to find peaceful solutions, but he had never seen a path to peace where hubris ran this deep. Varnak smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "We have our own weapons, Ambassador. Our fleet is unmatched. We have studied their tactics. Our scientists have already developed countermeasures." Sawyer's stomach tightened. The same arguments, always the same, confidence built on sand. He could see their fate already, playing out in his mind. Entire fleets, proud and mighty, turned into floating wreckage. Planets set ablaze by the Azartha's precision strikes, their formidable defenses crumbling like paper under the weight of overwhelming power. But he could not force them to see what they refused to acknowledge. "I have stood on worlds destroyed by the Azarth," Sawyer said, his voice softer now, a quiet plea. "Worlds that were far more advanced than you can imagine. They believed as you do, that they were untouchable, that they had an answer to every threat. But the Azarth are not enemies who fight for victory, they fight to erase. Once their focus is upon you, there is no retreat." A flicker of uncertainty passed through the ranks of Karnath leaders, but it was fleeting. Varnak's eyes hardened. "We are not afraid of them. Let them come. We will meet them with fire." Sawyer's hope faltered, though he kept his composure. He could see it now, the ironclad will of a proud species marching headlong into annihilation, all because they could not imagine their defeat. It was a tragedy he had witnessed too many times before. As he looked around the chamber, he saw the same certainty etched into the faces of each leader, the same unwavering belief in their superiority. There was nothing more he could say. Sawyer straightened, drawing in a slow breath. "Then I wish you luck," he said finally, his voice resigned. "And I hope, for the sake of your people, that I am wrong." Without another word, he turned and left the chamber. The doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the Karnath leaders to their fatal decision. As he walked through the grand hallways of the Karnath capital, Sawyer couldn't shake the hollow feeling in his chest. He had done what he could. The warning had been delivered, but it had fallen on deaf ears. The war would come, and the Carnath would be ready to fight, but they were not prepared for what was about to follow. Sawyer stepped into his ship, his mind heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The engines hummed to life as he left the Carnath homeworld behind. In the vast expanse of space, he could already feel the threads of destiny tightening. The galaxy would soon learn that some wars should never be fought. The Carnath war machine roared to life with the kind of grandeur that had brought empires to their knees in the past. Varnak, supreme strategist, stood on the bridge of his flagship, invincible, gazing out at the endless stars through the panoramic viewport. Before him, hundreds of ships assembled, the core of the Carnath armada, sleek, silver vessels bristling with weapons, designed for speed and devastating firepower. It was a fleet built for conquest, a testament to their dominance in the galaxy. Around him, officers moved with precision, their eyes glowing with anticipation. There was no fear here, no hesitation, only the certainty of victory. The human diplomat was wrong, Varnak thought. He had listened to Sawyer's warnings, but the human did not understand the resolve of the Carnath. They had fought and won wars against countless enemies. The Azarth coalition was merely the next in a long line of challengers, and the Carnath would crush them, just as they had done before. "We will strike first," Varnak declared, his voice cutting through the hum of the bridge. "Let them know we are not prey to be hunted. We will show them what it means to challenge the Carnath." His command rippled across the fleet, and within moments, ships began to mobilize, their engines flaring to life. Varnak's strategy was simple: overwhelm the Azarth with speed and firepower, crush their advance, and send them retreating back into the dark corners of the galaxy. His fleet would be the hammer that shattered their arrogance. The Carnath fleet surged into Azarth space with ruthless efficiency. Their first target was a small border outpost, barely defended and easily overwhelmed. The alien forces guarding it were unprepared for the sudden onslaught. Varnak watched from the command deck as his ships closed in, unleashing torrents of energy beams and missile barrages. The outpost's defenses flickered, shields failing within minutes. Too easy, Varnak thought, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. His officers exchanged triumphant glances as the enemy ships disintegrated in the explosions, their remains floating lifelessly in the void. The Carnath had won their first victory, and the thrill of conquest rippled through the fleet. Messages of praise flooded Varnak's communication lines from the ruling council back on Carnath Prime. They had struck the first blow, and morale soared. But even in their moment of triumph, there were signs, small, subtle, that something wasn't quite right. "Supreme Strategist," one of his officers reported, "we detected unusual energy signatures before the outpost fell. It appears their communication systems were transmitting before we shut them down. The Azarth may be aware of our presence sooner than we anticipated." Varnak waved away the concern. "Let them come. It will only save us the trouble of hunting them down." But the truth was, the Azarth were already coming. As the Carnath fleet prepared for its next strike, Azarth scout ships appeared on their scanners, small, fast, and annoyingly elusive. The Carnath's larger vessels struggled to pin them down as the enemy slipped in and out of radar, firing precision strikes at vulnerable points in their fleet. It was a tactic the Carnath were unaccustomed to. They were used to direct engagements, overwhelming force, and brute strength. The Azarth seemed content to harass and retreat, leaving behind no wreckage for study, no bodies for analysis. Varnak's confidence remained intact, though. "They're afraid to engage us directly," he told his crew. "This is merely a delaying tactic." The next battle, a more significant engagement near a distant moon, proved his theory, at least at first. The Carnath's superior numbers and firepower began to tell as they cornered an Azarth fleet near an orbital station. This time, the Carnath pressed the advantage, systematically dismantling the smaller Azarth ships. Energy beams seared through the void, ripping enemy vessels apart in spectacular explosions that lit up the moon's surface. It was another victory, another sign that the Azarth were not invincible after all. But as the Carnath fleet moved to secure the station, something changed. The enemy tactics shifted with alarming precision. Larger Azarth vessels suddenly emerged from the dark side of the moon, attacking with advanced weaponry the Karnath had never seen before. The Karnath ship's shields faltered, their systems scrambled by bursts of energy that bypassed even their most advanced defenses. Countermeasures! Varnak barked, but the damage had already been done. The battle quickly became chaotic. Karnath cruisers, once steady and methodical, were now scrambling to regroup. For the first time, Varnak saw uncertainty in the eyes of his officers. The Azarth forces were few in number, but they fought with terrifying precision. They didn't need to win every engagement, they only needed to survive long enough to make the Karnath bleed. By the time the Karnath fleet limped away from the battle, they had won, but the price was far higher than Varnak had anticipated. Several capital ships were heavily damaged, and their initial confidence had been shaken. Whispers of concern began to surface among the crew, though no one dared voice them aloud. Varnak stood at the helm, staring out into the void. The taste of victory felt hollow now, and a cold knot formed in his chest. The Azarth were testing them, probing for weaknesses. The war was just beginning, and the Karnatha's arrogance had blinded them to the scale of what was coming. Varnak stood on the bridge of Invincible, the heart of the Karnath fleet, his hands clenched tightly behind his back as the final preparations for the assault were completed. Ahead of him stretched the battlefield, a distant, desolate star system on the fringes of Azarth space. This was where the Karnath would strike their decisive blow. This was where they would end the war. He had gathered every available ship, the full might of the Dominion's armada, a force so vast it blotted out entire sections of the starscape. Thousands of vessels, warships, cruisers, and destroyers, assembled in perfect formation, ready to crush the Azarth once and for all. The human's warnings echoed faintly in his mind, but he dismissed them. The earlier skirmishes had been costly, yes, but this time there would be no retreat, no calculated retreat by the Azarth. He would corner them and annihilate them. Supreme Strategist, all fleets report ready, came the steady voice of his lieutenant. Varnak gave a slow nod, his face a mask of grim determination. Then let us begin. With a single command, the Karnath armada surged forward, a wave of silver death hurtling through space toward the Azarth defensive line. The plan was simple: overwhelm them with sheer force, break through their ranks, and strike at their heart. Varnak had studied every possible scenario, anticipated every move the enemy could make. This was his moment. But from the start, something felt wrong. The Azarth forces did not behave as expected. They were few, vastly outnumbered, yet they didn't retreat, nor did they engage in the kind of hit-and-run tactics that had previously frustrated the Karnath. Instead, they held their ground, waiting with an unsettling calm. They're just sitting there, Varnak muttered, narrowing his eyes. Why? The Karnath armada closed in, weapons primed to fire, but before they could unleash their fury, the battlefield lit up with a brilliance that blazed across the void. Out of nowhere, Azarth warships emerged from deep space, materializing with uncanny precision, their sleek, obsidian forms gliding into position around the Karnath fleet. These were not the scout ships or smaller vessels that the Karnath had faced before. These were behemoths, bristling with weaponry far beyond anything Varnak had anticipated. Shields up! Varnak barked, but it was already too late. The Azarth unleashed their full arsenal in a devastating barrage of energy beams and gravitational weapons that tore through the Karnath fleet with terrifying efficiency. Ships that had once stood as symbols of Karnath might were shredded like paper, their shields unable to withstand the concentrated firepower. Explosions rippled across the battlefield, turning proud warships into debris fields in moments. Varnak's hands tightened on the railing, knuckles white. How did they? It was not just their firepower that stunned him. It was the coordination, the flawless execution. The Azarth had been waiting for this, and the Karnath had walked straight into their trap. Every move Varnak had planned was being countered with brutal precision, as though the enemy had known exactly what he was going to do before he did it. On the bridge, the atmosphere had shifted from cold confidence to something far more dangerous: panic. Sir, we've lost 3 capital ships, one officer shouted. Our right flank is collapsing, another screamed. They've broken through the line. Regroup! Varnak roared, trying to reassert control, but it was futile. His fleet was being torn apart faster than orders could be relayed. The Azarth moved with mechanical precision, their ships gliding through the carnage with an eerie grace, picking off Karnath vessels one by one. For the first time in his career, Varnak felt helpless. He had led his people to victory in countless battles, had crushed empires and annihilated enemies without hesitation. But here, against the Azarth, all his strategies, all his experience, were worthless. The enemy was beyond anything he had prepared for. His ship shook violently as an energy beam from an Azarth dreadnought tore through the hull, alarms blaring as damage reports flooded in. Fires broke out across the bridge, casting a red glow over the chaos. Varnak barely registered it. His mind was racing, searching for a way out, some advantage, some weakness in the Azartha's unyielding onslaught, but there was none. They had outthought him at every turn, and now they were finishing what they had started. Another explosion rocked the ship, and Varnak stumbled, catching himself on the railing. Through the smoke and fire, he looked out at the battlefield, what remained of it. Hundreds of Karnath's ships were reduced to wreckage, the once mighty fleet scattered, burning in the cold void of space. The Azarth continued their assault, relentless, methodical, as though this was nothing more than a routine operation. He could hear the cries of his crew, the frantic shouts of officers trying to maintain some semblance of order. But in his heart, Varnak knew it was over. How? He whispered to himself, staring at the destruction unfolding before him. In that moment, he remembered Sawyer's words, "This is not a war you can win." The weight of his arrogance crashed down on him, crushing the last vestiges of pride that had driven him to this moment. He had ignored the warnings. He had led his people to this slaughter, blinded by his belief in their invincibility. And now, the Karnath would pay the price. "Sir, we need to retreat." A voice cut through the chaos, desperate. Varnak didn't answer. There was no retreat. No victory. Only defeat. As the Invincible took another direct hit, flames consuming the bridge, Varnak stood motionless, watching as the stars dimmed around him, swallowed by the darkness of his failure. The once mighty Karnath were broken, their armada shattered, and the galaxy would never forget the price of their hubris. The silence that followed the war was vast and oppressive. It hung in the cold expanse of space where once the mighty Karnath fleet had gathered, now nothing more than debris fields and drifting wreckage. The fires had long since burned out, leaving only the quiet desolation of a species that had dared too much and lost everything. Ambassador Sawyer sat alone in his ship, the glow of distant stars casting faint light across the small cabin. He had received the news of the Karnath defeat just hours ago, though it was hardly unexpected. He had warned them. He had pleaded with them. And yet, the outcome had been inevitable. The Azarth had done exactly what they always did, erased any who stood in their way. There was no room for compromise with an enemy like that. A soft beep signaled the arrival of a message. Sawyer glanced at the screen. It was a communique from the Human Council, asking for a report on the situation. They wanted to know the details of the Karnath defeat, what could be learned from their mistakes, how humanity might avoid a similar fate. Sawyer sighed, leaning back in his chair. What could he say that they didn't already know? The lesson was clear: pride and arrogance were dangerous companions. The Karnath had been so certain of their superiority, so blinded by their own legend, that they had failed to see the truth staring them in the face. A soft knock echoed through the ship's hull as his second-in-command, Lieutenant Raya, entered the cabin. She moved quietly, her expression somber, as she handed Sawyer a data pad. "It's worse than we thought," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Azarth didn't just destroy their fleet, they wiped out every outpost, every colony. The Karnath homeworld has gone silent." Sawyer felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had expected the Karnath to be humbled, not erased. "The Azarth, they really don't leave anything behind, do they?" Raya shook her head. "No, sir. They don't." For a long moment neither spoke. Sawyer's mind was heavy with the weight of it all, the lives lost, the worlds destroyed, the utter finality of the Azartha's wrath. He had seen it before, but each time it left him feeling hollow, as though a part of the galaxy itself had been extinguished. The Karnath had been an old species, with traditions and history that stretched back millennia. Now they were nothing more than a memory, a cautionary tale for others to learn from, if they could. They wouldn't listen, Sawyer said quietly, breaking the silence. They thought they were invincible. But no one is invincible. Raya frowned. What happens now? Will the Azarth turn their sights on us next? Sawyer tapped his fingers on the edge of the data pad, considering her question. It was a possibility, one that had haunted humanity's leaders for years. They had kept a careful distance from the Azarth, steering clear of conflict, knowing that a direct confrontation would likely end in the same way as it had for the Karnath. But for how long could they avoid the inevitable? We keep doing what we've been doing, Sawyer said. We stay out of their path. We make sure they don't see us as a threat. But for how long? Raya's voice was tinged with frustration. How long before they decide we're next? Sawyer didn't have an answer. No one did. The Azarth were as mysterious as they were powerful, their motivations inscrutable to anyone outside their ranks. What little humanity knew of them had been pieced together from scattered reports and brief encounters, most of which ended in annihilation. He stood up, crossing the room to gaze out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Azarth were still moving, still expanding, still erasing anything that stood in their way. And somewhere, there were other species, perhaps just as proud, just as overconfident, who believed they could stand against them. But the galaxy had changed, and those who didn't adapt would be swept aside. Sawyer's thoughts drifted back to the Karnath leaders, to Varnak and his unshakable conviction that his people were unbeatable. In the end, their strength had been their downfall. They had fought because they believed they had no choice, because surrender would have been an admission of weakness. But in reality, it was their pride that had made them weak. They had walked into the jaws of the enemy without truly understanding what they faced. Turning to Raya, Sawyer's voice was soft but firm. We need to make sure we're not the next Karnath. She nodded, her face set with resolve. I'll prepare the report for the council. Maybe they'll listen this time. Sawyer hoped so. As he looked out into the vastness of space, he felt the weight of the future pressing down on him. There were always more wars to be fought, more battles to be won, or lost. But if there was one lesson to take from the fall of the Karnath, it was this: some wars couldn't be won, no matter how strong or proud a species thought itself to be. And sometimes, the only victory was survival. The Karnath were gone, the Azarth still out there, and the galaxy continued to spin. But for Sawyer and humanity, the real battle had only just begun, the battle to remain unseen, untouched, and alive.